So I mentioned my cognitive rigor matrices. I started with a very basic one back in 2009. And since then, I've developed 8 content-specific matrices. You'll notice that along the top, you see Webb's depth of knowledge levels. Down the side, you see Bloom's taxonomy levels. And what I started to do, and this was on a trip after I worked with teachers who said, Karin, Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge really are just 2 ways to say the same thing. And I knew that wasn't true, but it wasn't until I started to put together examples in reading and math science and social studies before I realized that I could be working with my students at a create level, at an evaluate level, on an analysis level, but still be pretty low level. You'll also notice something in most of these rigor matrices. One, that they're content specific because every content domain has a schema. So you need to have specific examples. And the other one is there's kind of a grayed out area under evaluate at the lowest DOK levels. I thought about this and I said, well, what is a low level evaluation? It's really when you state an opinion, you have no supporting evidence. An unsupported generalization, kids understand it as an UG. And we've used that phrase in classrooms. That's an UG you need supporting evidence for. So you may want to download these. The first 4 are content specific, and then the other 4 are fine arts and teaching world languages, teaching health and phys ed, and career and technical education. But they all show content examples. Here's a very simplified version. If a teacher wanted to plan a series of tasks for a class, they might take a blank matrix, and you see the UGs in there. We don't want to just hear that you didn't like the story. But if we just read Little Red Riding Hood, we could ask basic questions. What color was Red's cape? What's the story about? But here's the connection you want to make with this. If we teach them how to summarize, then they could compare characters. If they know how to summarize, they could also provide context for an interpretation of the text. Or they could read multiple texts about wolves in literature. The idea is the matrix helps you to see how to maybe have a starting point and move to a deeper level. So just a little bit about the cognitive rigor matrix. You can download these. They are also in the book in Appendix B. They're content specific. They provide a range of possibilities, but it's not limited to those. But I built in descriptors working with teachers over the years so that you have a lot of ways to think about depth of knowledge when you plan. Here's the thing I want you to notice though. If you shift the DOK levels from 1 and 2 to 3 and 4, you change the student's role from taking in information to producing information, and shifting the role deepens learning. So here's a simplified version of shifting roles of teacher. Questions a teacher asks in DLK1 focuses attention. Who, what, where, how. They model, they define, they scaffold so kids can access and focus. When you move to DOK2, the teacher is asking them to classify things, compare things. They're asking to give examples. They're building schema. When you get to DOK3, questions are now probing reasons. Why do you say that? Can you find evidence for that? And at 4, it's bringing in other sources. Are there biases? Read this, now read this. What do you think about that? So at DOK 1 and 2, kids are just taking in information. Your competencies, though, are about FAR transfer. So when you write a competency statement, you're trying to focus on kids that are able to uncover accurate and credible information, to develop evidence, to test ideas, to transfer and construct new knowledge. So I often get the question, aren't competencies the same as standards? A lot of schools that have moved to standards-based have said, our standards are our competencies. So here's a comparison that you can see on page 68 in the book. Basically, standards are written in teacher language. Competencies are written as I can, things students can do. Standards are of varying grain sizes, which means some of them are very small grained. You know these terms, you can apply editing skills, or they're very large grained. You can write a text-based argument. So the grain sizes are different. Where a competency is always a grain size that's large, but it's supported by multiple standards. So you bundle the standards together and say, I can give you a complex task that hits 3 or 4 standards. There's fewer competencies at a grade level or content area than you would see a comparable number of standards. So teachers who are trying to track 30 standards in math, 30 standards in ELA, 30 standards in science, it's overwhelming. But if you have a few competencies you work on throughout the year that hit all of the standards over and over again, you have a better opportunity to report on not only are they meeting the standards, but are they working at a more complex level. When you give an assessment in a competency-based system, it tells you whether or not students are ready to go on, to go to the next level. In a standards-based system, you don't always have that opportunity to say, you haven't mastered it yet, so let's build in some opportunities to master it before you go on. DOK levels vary with standards. A lot of standards are written at a low level. It isn't until you combine standards together that you can get to DOK 3 or 4. If you are working in a standards-based system, you might want to take a minute and just think about, are we doing the things in the standards list? And could we see how we could bundle standards and make them more manageable to track? That's a good first question. A concrete example, I'm going to take an example from a 3rd grade competency from New Hampshire. And if you have a competency that says students will analyze a topic or a text using sources, applying their information, organizational strategies, and providing evidence, you would take that competency and break it down and say, well, are there some reading standards there? Are some writing standards embedded there? What about language or speaking and listening? So competency is bigger and broader. I worked with New Hampshire to develop what they call model competencies. Schools have the option of using them or modifying them in some way, but they model the idea of a large standard broken into a large competency broken down by alignment with different standards. Are there standards in different content areas that would actually align? And then what are the DOK levels that would match some of the learning targets? Because the products and performance are going to go beyond any individual reading, writing, language, speaking, and listening standard, probably. So again, this is about teacher clarity. If teachers can develop some competency statements, expectations for learning, and address them in similar ways across classrooms, that makes learning more equitable for all kids. I'm taking that competency that we just saw on the last page, and I'm showing you a tool. It's tool 5 on page 83, where we take the competency, we develop I can statements, and these come right from New Hampshire's work, where you'll find a link. And I color coded them so you could see that some of the I can statements might be at a DOK 1. Being able to state an opinion that answers a question about a topic or text. Is the author trying to say this? So I can state an opinion. Yes, he is. No, she is not. I can edit grammar, usage, and mechanics. That's a very basic kind of thing. Locating information, organizing information, maybe elaborating, is all going to land in that DOK 2. So now you can kind of see how DOK 2 ought to be a chunk of your assessments because it's conceptual. And then DOK 3 is, now can I use the evidence I collected and articulate clearly how that supports a conclusion? Can I revise my overall text for clarity? If I want that to move to a DOK 4, they're reading multiple sources. And reading can be hearing it read, reading it with someone else, viewing it. Reading is a pretty broad, hearing a speaker talk. So multiple sources isn't always reading. Once you organize your competency, your ICANNs, you identify the DOK levels. Then at the bottom of the tool, now you can list what standards it's aligned to. So it's a pretty smooth process. Rather than starting with standards, starting with a broad statement and saying, well, this hits 4 or 7 different standards. And then in the left-hand box, what do I have to actually teach? I'm teaching 3rd grade. This is a 3rd grade competency. Have I taught use of transitions? Have I taught about text features? Have I taught the difference between a fact and an opinion? I might not have to teach all of those things if they already know it. So now it's your turn to analyze. And I just pulled 3 competency statements from New Hampshire's work. These are organized in a continuum. So when you see grades 3, 4, there is a K2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and high school table. You'll see the competency at the top. These are 3 different competency statements. Underneath each competency statement, you will see ICANNs. And at the bottom, they've already aligned them to different standards. So if I went down to the standards and I saw RL, well, that's reading literature. Standards 3, standard 9, 10. So those standards are aligned already. So as I'm working towards teaching this competency and assessing it, I know I'm hitting multiple standards. Same is true of the next one. This is a 5th and 6th grade one. And you see 2 things here. One, that it says grades 5, 6, because the research doesn't say the 5th graders can learn this and 6th graders can learn that. The research was used to build these. And it usually says in a grade band, most students by the end of 6th grade can design an investigation and gather data. So here you see 5th grade standards and 6th grade standards. You could be hitting this over 2 years. And then in 7th and 8th grade, this is another one where there are multiple reading, writing, and language standards across grades 7 and 8. So here is your job to analyze these competencies. You're going to take a little time, and you could, if you have a larger group, you could, in small groups, pick one competency. First, analyze the DOK level of the competency in the shading, and then look at the ICANNs and think about, are some of them more in a DOK 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4? Take some time to have this discussion because it will help you when you start to think about your own competency statements. So now that you've had a chance to look at that and you're probably waiting for the answer key, I'm not going to give you the answer key. I'm just not. But a general statement would be, those competencies were either at a DOK 3 or 4, and there was a range of DOK levels in the ICANN statements. You could pull out the cognitive rigor matrix for reading, writing, and mathematics, and you could probably match up most of those ICANNs. So now we're going to move into this last section for today, and I call these pit stops. So if you were in a race, you might at certain times say, we have to come into with our pit crew and look at some aspect of what how the car is functioning, and fix something, update something, replace something. The tires are wearing down. We got to put new tires on. Think of this as a big picture of CBE development, but you might revisit many of these multiple times, and usually you get feedback along the way. So right now we've been talking about pit stop 1. Do you have any competencies? Do you agree on what those learning goals are? And have you analyzed them to look at the standards and the rigor in those competencies? If you haven't, you want to spend some time here. This doesn't have to be done by every teacher in the school. Oh, by the way, it could be done by smaller groups working maybe in departments or grade level teams to analyze different ones and then come back together. That's probably a more efficient way to do this. So you're going to spend a little time now that you have your profile of the graduate. Now let's create some competencies that support the profile of the graduate. So at this stage, and you can read pages 74 to 78, a little more detail, but your competencies are going to be the foundation. They have to be measurable and manageable. Measurable means we can actually observe this And manageable means you don't have too many. My rule of thumb is always don't have more than 8 per grade level or content area, because it would be too much. You could have 6, you could have 4, but have them not too big and not too narrow. If they're too narrow, you're going to end up a lot. If you have them too large, you're going to have 57 varieties of I can statements. They're valid. In other words, they're aligned with the standards you intended to align them with. They're aligned with the DOK levels you intended. And you can transfer these skills to other situations, other learning situations. The bottom line is your I can statements are going to provide instructional guidance. Now you're going to know what to teach, how to help scaffold along a continuum, and how to measure progress. So that's why, and you know, it says develop or adapt. I think it's easier to adapt somebody else's competency statements because you already have a starting point. It's hard to start from scratch. So I want you to think of a current learning outcome in your school now. Does it align with, and it says the criteria in tool 3, but those criteria are, is it relevant to the kids' lives? Is it aligned, clearly aligned to standards and cognitive demand? Does it provide equity for all kids and a learning pathway and opportunities to learn? So if you had to stop and think, what are our learning outcomes? A lot of schools sometimes have a school-wide writing or communication statement as a learning outcome. That's probably the most common. Sometimes they might have a ability to solve problems. So a lot of schools have pieces of this, but near the end of this session, I'll introduce the actual tool 3, and it shows you a continuum of where might you be in developing your competency statements. Take a minute, reflect individually, or discuss this. And now for your homework. On the last slide, I have given you links to some sample competency statements from other places, or examine your existing learning goals and competencies. But do it together, because you want to break it down and say, what are the I can statements that go with this? Are these aligned to standards? What DOK levels are these at? And your end result, because I don't want you just talking, I want you to be doing. This is performance. I want you to develop or adapt some academic competency statements for your grade level or content area. And then build some I can statements for the competency. What are students going to be doing to demonstrate mastery? So a thought about I cans. When we wrote competency statements for New Hampshire, the question always was, what would kids be doing? What would they be showing you they knew if they were meeting this competency? So even though it might say they can edit a text, that wasn't a standalone. It was like, I have to teach them how to edit text so they can do it in the final task that I give them. You can use CBE Tool 5 to help you with this work, and that is on page 83. It looks like this. So step 1 is to, after you write a competency, underline what the key learnings are. So again, I've tried to show you a similar example throughout. I would underline, analyze a topic, use a variety of sources, use evidence, support an opinion. So those are key learnings. From those key learnings, then I write my I can statements. Kid-friendly statements. What can students do? Now, some of those things might not be in an actual standard, like adding visuals to elaborate on ideas, but in the real world, all good narratives, all good informational texts include visuals of some kind. So we always want to build that in, what makes a good piece of writing, even if it's not explicit in a standard. Step 3, now what am I going to have to teach so kids can do those things in the I can statements? This will be different for different schools and different places, but this is the same list. What are the different DOK levels? So again, this isn't color-coded, but you see this repeated. And then align it to the standards and personal skills, so that might be a combination. And last of all, start to think about, how am I going to assess all this stuff? Because I'm going to assess different I can statements differently. That's the beauty of CBE Tool 5, is it takes a competency and gives you many, you don't have to teach the same way, but you have to be going to the same destination. Being able to analyze a topic or a text using a variety of sources and using supporting evidence to support an opinion. It keeps us all sort of using a common language. If you prefer to work on personal success skills competencies, there's an example here from page 76 where I was giving feedback to a group of Chicago public schools who were working on their social and emotional learning competency statements. In the first column, before they got feedback, they had a competency statement about empathy. I can recognize feelings and perspectives. I read that and I thought, well, big deal. You can recognize it and that's it. Just recognizing feelings might be possible to assess. Do you recognize it? Yeah, I recognize it. Okay, now we're done. It's like yes or no. So maybe the competency statement needs to be revised so that I can recognize it, I can respond to it, and I can evaluate my response. So what do I do? What is empathy about? Empathy is about responding to other people. It's not just saying, wow, I know how he feels. So this would be how you fine-tune a competency statement. This is another one that was for goal setting, and it said, I can demonstrate skills related to my personal and my academic goals. And that was all in one statement. And my feeling was that sometimes if students have a personal goal, they approach it very differently from an academic goal. Often an academic goal was a teacher gave me an assignment and I completed it. For personal goals, I want to learn about this and I'm going to stick with it. I love playing soccer. I love playing the piano. I want to learn how to do gymnastics. I'll stick with it. So my suggestion here was I can demonstrate and reflect on the skills I'm using. So again, it's not just demonstrate the skills. I can reflect on, I can say, these are the skills I used, and this is what I'm learning from using those skills. So if you're going in this direction with your competencies, and there are states and schools that start here, and then they move from here into the academic. So that's another option. I mentioned CBE Tool 3, it's on page 164, and here's the idea. A well-written competency statement has to be relevant to the big ideas of the discipline. Why do you have that competency statement? If we think empathy is important because to negotiate your place in the world, you have to respond to others and you have to address that they're feeling differently than you are, that's pretty important. So you could justify the empathy competency. You could justify a goal-setting competency. You could justify a communication competency where they can communicate ideas from a project. Is it aligned to either prioritized standards? And when we say local standards, like does your school have some local important skills that you want to promote in kids? A lot of schools do. When I was a teacher and when I was a school administrator, we often had those 4 or 5 skills, be kind to other people. That's kind of an empathy competency. So think about those as, is your competency aligned to something that everybody agrees is important? Does it assess deeper learning? Is it equitable for all students? Do they all have to show their understanding the same way, or are there many ways they can show their learning? Are there different pathways they can take? And probably the most important, is it embedded in ongoing instruction? Have they learned how to do it? Did you model it? Did they role play activities with it? Did they read about it? In other words, we can't expect kids to meet these rigorous competencies if they haven't had opportunities. So this is a tool that might be helpful in that regard. I provided a screenshot of tool 1A. We call it one of the readiness tools. This tool is about, do we have competencies? Are we moving forward with our implementation of writing and using competencies? We often use these tools with a whole staff conversation. If you're just starting out, you probably have graduation requirements, for example, but you haven't developed other ways other than Carnegie units to meet graduation requirements. As you move into emerging, maybe now you have a profile of the graduate. You've gotten input from staff or community, And your graduation requirements are beginning to reflect some of the things you have. Some schools will have a graduation exhibition requirement, which taps some of these other skills. So that would be an example of we're merging towards a full implementation of our profile of graduate is really guiding our work. So this is a good pit stop to come back to from time to time over the course of a couple of years, actually, to see where you are in the process. We assume that if you're on this webinar, you are initiating at the minimum. And then finally, I provided some resources. Some of the resources are sample competencies. So I mentioned the model competencies from New Hampshire. There is an example from ELA Math K-8 and also the high school math. I will tell you, when we did the high school math first, we did not have I can statements. And the state came back to me and said, Karin, we need to reconvene the committee. We'd like you to redo the math competencies because they are limiting in how people are interpreting them, and they are confusing a lot of people. Everybody has a different idea. If we could revise them and add the I can statement. So that was a good process of learning to really validate how important the I can statements are, because initially they weren't there. New Hampshire has other competencies posted, but these are just some that I have a link to. And then Building 21 also has competencies that you can download. Building 21 is 21st century skills, and they have multiple content areas across grade levels. So all these examples show a continuum where kids are working on the same competencies, getting more sophisticated over time. And I think they provide a strong model. There probably are more, but you can only put so many on a slide. So you might, on your faculty, want to go out and find other examples. Remember, I said it's easier to adapt somebody else's competencies than to start from scratch. And if you already have some to work with, you're going to save yourself a lot of time. Thank you. This concludes session 2. And if you have questions, you can always contact me, but this is a big and important piece of your work. Thank you.